Penguin Random House Audio presents Hunting in America, a novel, by Tehila Hakimi. Translated by Joanna Chen. Read for you by Sharone Halevy. To My Love. The First Shot. 1. The first time I went shooting in America, I hit a tree. We'd been outdoors for a while, probably a few hours. The first shot hit a tree, but the next one whistled through the leaves. I stopped shooting, the animal fled, and everything went quiet. When I raised my head from the gun sight, I noticed David and the others staring at me, and I was embarrassed. I left them where they stood and approached the tree. I searched for the bullet but couldn't find it. It must have penetrated the trunk. The scent of the earth was pungent and overpowered the acrid smell of the gunpowder, which dissipated into the air. I remained by the tree a few more moments. We had left the office early that day, shortly after lunch. There had been an awkward conference call with Israeli management that morning. The information they offered was unclear, their messages mixed, and the conversation left everyone uneasy. I was catching up on emails when David came into my office and asked if he was interrupting. He told me they'd decided to finish up for the day, and when I looked at him in confusion, he smiled and said he was going out to the field to shoot with some of the guys. Would you like to join us? When I returned to where the others stood, David patted me on the back. I shuddered, feeling each of his fingers through my sweater. They were spread apart, like in yoga class when the instructor tells you to extend your fingers and toes like duck feet. David murmured something like, "Way to go," in a somewhat perfunctory tone that nonetheless felt good. I usually didn't like it if someone offered encouragement when I was already doing my best. It had the opposite effect on me. I smiled and said it had been 20 years, maybe more, since I'd shot a gun. Until that moment, I'd preferred to put behind me the fact that I had once handled firearms, but suddenly it came back. It just slipped out. I barely noticed. 2. I thought I had a pretty good understanding of American etiquette long before that, but no amount of TV, movies, email correspondence, or video conferences with American colleagues had prepared me. For starters, the daily office routine was more tiring than what I was accustomed to back in Israel. For an entire month, I found myself wandering around feeling jet-lagged. This wasn't the usual fatigue of a transatlantic flight, nor was I homesick. I didn't regret my decision to leave Israel. On the contrary, I arrived in the United States with a sense of relief and anticipation. During the first few weeks, my long workdays ended with a pounding headache. Flashing an automatic smile every time someone approached me became a habit. The smile was wide, but not the kind that creates wrinkles. Convincing enough, although I didn't entirely recognize myself. It was the kind of smile suitable for a profile picture on LinkedIn, or maybe a dating app. I got to know David better during that first week. Every day he'd drop by my office to invite me to join the engineering team in the cafeteria for lunch breaks and to let me know what time they were meeting up. Besides David, I chatted a few times with Sean, a young guy I'd already corresponded with a little before I arrived in the United States. And there was Joan. We shared an office, and she was nice from the start. The days were filled with constant stress. I made an effort to speak English without an accent. I wrote meticulous emails, trying to emulate the wordiness of my colleagues. It was Joan who tipped me off about the emails. One morning before the daily grind began, she cornered me, closing the door to our office. She said she knew it wasn't deliberate, and I shouldn't be embarrassed. She had family in Israel and understood the mentality. But the direct tone of my emails might be misconstrued as aggressive. They already have a boss, she concluded with a smile. Later that day, she sent me an email with copious comments. She'd copied one of mine and attached it to a separate document with corrections. She opened brackets after every other sentence and explained how to rephrase it. Her explanations were detailed and mostly began with these words: "It would be even better to write this." In addition to her deletions and comments, she made sure to occasionally compliment me on a successful turn of phrase. When I thanked her for her help, she said it was her pleasure, that it was no big deal. "You're a quick learner. Soon you won't need me anymore," she added. 3. The second time I went shooting in America, David brought along 2 of his friends. It was a Saturday, and this time no one from the office joined us. Once again, I was the only woman, but I was used to this. Most of the time, I was the only woman on the team, the only woman in the meeting. Sometimes I was the only woman in the entire building. David said we were going to drive further out, to a different area. They had received an email from the local Fish and Wildlife Authority with whom they were registered, inviting them to help reduce the number of deer. The idea was to shoot to kill, but also to scare them off, to move them away from the most densely populated areas. Like warning shots, I told David, who didn't seem to get it and threw me a suspicious look. On the way there, he said it would be good hunting practice for someone like me, who was just starting out. He explained there was usually a specified bag limit, but that licensed hunters had been repeatedly called on since the beginning of the season to help with the deer situation. I mostly kept quiet and listened carefully while he was talking. I wanted to get up to speed. At this stage, I still didn't have my own rifle, so David lent me one of his. Most of my coworkers possessed firearms at home. Some even kept a gun in the trunk. There were also a few who kept a small pistol in the glove compartment. It was raining when we arrived, but this wasn't a problem. David said the rain would help us, that it would make it harder for the animals to feel our presence. "Under the cover of rain," I said, nodding knowingly. He looked at me weirdly again. We drove farther along. The road narrowed into a dirt track, and David slowed down. After a while, he stopped the truck, turned to face us, and said, "Ready?" He didn't wait for an answer. David led the way. I walked behind him, and the other 2 followed. After 30 or 40 minutes, I heard the signal we had agreed on, a bird-like chirp to indicate that an animal was close by. We froze. David subtly lifted and lowered the palm of his hand. This was the sign to hunker down. We sprawled on the ground. When I saw the buck standing in front of me, it was in repose, barely moving. Now it was up to me. Before the others had time to exchange glances or determine which of us had a direct line of vision, I had already fired. 1 shot, and then another. 1 to the torso, and the other to the neck. A moment later, the buck fell heavily to the ground. We approached the dead buck, and David identified the points of impact. He looked carefully at the first point, bleeding at the center of the torso, and then he turned to me and said it was a beautiful hit. Afterward, he pointed to the neck and said, "But not that one." The 3 of them dragged the buck to the truck. First, they wrapped it in a kind of tarp, and then covered it with thick material that David had tucked into his backpack earlier. Finally, they tied it up with rope. Everything happened fast. They were clearly skilled in this line of work. They took turns, 2 of them dragging it at a time. I followed slowly behind. All was quiet. During one of our pauses, David turned to me and said,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?